They handed out barf bags at this Western. Burt Reynolds said his should only be shown in prisons. The Catholic Church banned this one. These 10 Westerns were hated by everyone, and everyone was wrong. Marlon Brando and Jack Nicholson in the same Western. That was the pitch, and that's why everyone showed up. Then Brando started wearing dresses and doing Irish accents. The movie kept shifting between serious and bizarre. The ending was anticlimactic. People walked out confused and angry. Critics wrote brutal reviews. One of them called it fundamentally a bad Western, and that became the consensus for years. Here's what nobody understood in 1976. Brando was doing that stuff on purpose. The whole movie was deconstructing Western myths, playing with the genre in ways that almost made it a dark comedy. But audiences came in expecting cowboys and shootouts, and when they got Brando in a dress speaking in a brogue, they felt tricked. Decades later, people started going back to it. The cinematography's gorgeous. John Williams did this haunting score. And if you know it's not a traditional Western going in, those weird Brando choices are actually kind of fascinating. Clayton Moore played the Lone Ranger on TV for years. After the show ended, he kept doing appearances in the costume. Kids loved it, he loved it, everyone was happy. Then a studio decided to make a new Lone Ranger movie in 1981, and instead of just making the movie, they got a court order to legally ban Moore from wearing the mask. They didn't want some old guy from a TV show competing with their new film. Fans organized a boycott before the movie even came out. The media covered the controversy constantly. By the time The Legend of the Lone Ranger hit theaters, it didn't matter what was actually on screen. Everyone already hated it on principle. The movie bombed at the box office. For decades, it's been remembered as one of the worst Westerns of the 80s. Except watching it years later without all that baggage, it's actually a solid family Western. Christopher Lloyd's in it as the villain, and he's great. And the music is excellent. Robert Downey Sr. made a movie where a Christ figure parachutes into a frontier town, and there's gross-out humor and blasphemy and all this deliberately offensive satire. Most critics who saw it were horrified. The Los Angeles Times blasted it as utterly devoid of wit, wallowing in unremitting gross behavior. Revolting, incomprehensible, and absurdist were thrown around. One reviewer sniped that Downey had everything except talent, called Greaser's Palace his worst film. People walked out. In reality, it's Downey's most audacious film, because if you understood it was satire, like if Monty Python made a spaghetti western, all that offensive stuff was making specific points about religion and Hollywood. The problem was, most people in 1972 took it at face value. They saw shock value and gross-out humor and didn't understand it was intentionally subversive. They dismissed it as worthless trash. Years later, it got reassessed as a cult film. It's still weird and uncomfortable, but that was always the point. 1970, Grindhouse Circuit. A Western called Five Savage Men is making the rounds. It's a revenge story set in the Old West. School teacher gets kidnapped by outlaws, terrible things happen, she gets her revenge. Now, if you knew anything about grindhouse theaters in 1970, you knew what you were getting into. These places showed exploitation films. That was the whole point. You went there to see stuff that would never play at a regular theater. But Five Savage Men crossed some line that even grindhouse audiences weren't ready for. Critics went after it hard. Censors wanted it banned. People called it vile sleaze, said it was disgusting, said it shouldn't exist. Here's what's weird about that. A few years later, I Spit on Your Grave comes out. Same basic story. Woman gets assaulted, woman gets revenge. That movie became an infamous cult classic. Five Savage Men did the same thing, just with cowboys instead of modern day, but it got buried. The hate it got was way out of proportion. If you watch it now, knowing what grindhouse films were like back then, it's not doing anything weirder or more violent than what else was out there. It just happened to be a Western, and I guess people weren't ready for their cowboys to be that nasty. Alex Cox decides he's going to make a biopic about William Walker, an American mercenary who tried to take over Nicaragua back in the 1800s. except Cox is really making a movie about what the Reagan administration is doing in Nicaragua in the 1980s. So he throws in helicopters, Coca-Cola bottles, people reading Newsweek, right there in the middle of the 1800s. He's making his point as obvious as possible. American imperialism then, American imperialism now, it's the same thing. Universal Pictures releases it in 1987 and nobody knows what to do with it. The critical response is brutal. Roger Ebert gives it 0 stars, calls it pointless and obnoxious. Other reviewers can't handle how the film keeps shifting from serious violence to absurd comedy. They think Cox just lost his mind. Universal itself panicked before the movie even came out. They slashed the advertising budget and dumped it in limited release. Basically guaranteed it would bomb. And it did. Walker killed Cox's Hollywood career right there. Burt Reynolds is a young actor in 1966 trying to make it. He goes to Italy to do a spaghetti western for director Sergio Corbucci. It's called Navajo Joe. Reynolds plays a Navajo warrior seeking revenge. The production is cheap. Reynolds is wearing a questionable wig. The whole thing feels beneath him. And for the rest of his life, Reynolds would not shut up about how bad this movie was. His most famous quote about it is, "Navajo Joe is so awful it should only be shown in prisons and airplanes where nobody can leave." Critics at the time agreed with him. The New York Times called it colorless and generic. In Corbucci's filmography, it was considered bottom-tier stuff, way worse than his other westerns like Django. But is Navajo Joe actually one of the worst westerns ever made? Not even close. Ennio Morricone did the score. The music is so good that Quentin Tarantino used it in Kill Bill decades later. The movie itself is fast-paced, action-packed, gritty. As a 90-minute B-movie, it does exactly what it's supposed to do. It's a standard revenge western that's no worse than dozens of other cheap Italian westerns from that era. Sam Peckinpah made a Civil War western with Charlton Heston, and the studio completely destroyed it. They cut a bunch of his footage. The whole thing turned into this confusing mess that nobody could follow. Critics watched it and they could tell something was wrong. You could see pieces of a good film in there, but the way it was cut together just killed it. The movie flopped. Peckinpah disowned it. And for decades, Major Dundee was an example people pointed to when they wanted to talk about ambitious failures. Then in 2005, 40 years later, someone put together a restored version. They found 12 minutes of footage that had been cut. All the stuff critics complained about in 1965, the choppy editing, the confusing story, that was mostly fixed. The restored cut has a 97% on Rotten Tomatoes. Critics started calling it one of the best cavalry westerns of its era, a near-great film. So for 40 years, people hated a movie that didn't really exist. The version Peckinpah made never got released in 1965. This Spanish Western from 1972 gets called the most violent Western ever made, and that's not hype. There's limb hacking in it, eye gouging, disembowelment, all of it set in this frozen, snowy wilderness. It's half Western, half horror movie, and it does not mess around. When it came to American grindhouse theaters, some places started handing out barf bags as a promotional gimmick, because people were walking out sick. Critics and audiences were disgusted. The consensus was that this was nihilistic trash, exploitation garbage with no redeeming value. For years, that's all anyone said about it. But then something happened. A restoration came out, and people started actually watching it again. And some of them realized there's more going on here than just gore. The cinematography is beautiful. All that snow, the isolation, it's shot really well. And if you know your westerns, you can see this film's influence all over The Hateful Eight. Now look, this movie is not for most people. It's extremely violent. It's bleak and cynical. If you sit down expecting a traditional western, you're going to hate it. But that's not what it was trying to be. It was pushing boundaries, seeing how far you could take a western into horror territory in the early 70s. And if you go in knowing that's what you're getting, it actually works. David Selznick made this big Technicolor Western in 1946, and it caused a massive scandal. The Catholic Church condemned it. Memphis banned it. Several other cities banned it too. Critics called it vulgar trash and gave it a nickname, Lust in the Dust. What was so offensive about it? It was about a mixed-race love affair. There was kissing on screen, there was violence and passion and sex. Selznick was deliberately pushing boundaries, and 1940s America lost its mind. Here's the funny part. The film got multiple Oscar nominations. And over time, it developed this cult following. People loved it specifically for the stuff it got condemned for. All that over-the-top melodrama and uninhibited energy. Heaven's Gate is the ultimate example of an overhated Western. Michael Cimino made this epic about the Johnson County War in Wyoming, and it became the most notorious disaster in Hollywood history. The New York Times said it was like a forced 4-hour walking tour of one's own living room. It bombed so badly at the box office it killed United Artists as a studio, and for decades, Heaven's Gate was held up as maybe the worst movie ever made. Except that's not what it actually is. In 2004, there was a documentary arguing that Heaven's Gate had been unfairly judged. Modern critics started rewatching it, and they realized the cinematography is gorgeous. The period detail is incredible. Yes, it's long, yes, it's indulgent, but it's not unwatchable. It's not even bad. One of the producers said later that the film gets held up as the worst movie ever made, and that's just not true. The backlash was so intense and so overblown that it buried the actual film underneath it.